Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be looking at some chess games once again. I'm going to be doing a recap, but it will be very different and frankly quite special, as I'm going to be looking at the games that my wife, I am married in case you didn't know that, played quite recently in the American Continental Chess Championship being held in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Now, the Continental Chess Championship is an event that features the best players in the Americas. It's a situation where the winner automatically will qualify for the World Cup. Now, on the women's side, there's only the winner who makes it. I actually played the Continental Chess Championship all the way back in 2003 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I was able to qualify to play in the Men's World Cup, which was held in Libya in 2004, which was the start sort of breaking through and playing in the top events. So at any rate, this recap should be a lot of fun, and let's get right into the action. Now, before we get into this, I want to sort of also tell one other story about Santo Domingo, which is a very special place to me. I actually played there all the way back in the year 2002. I made my second Grandmaster norm there in a tournament that was held, I believe, in 2001, 2002, and maybe 2003 as well. Now, additionally, I would also say one of the sad parts about chess is in many cases, there are terms that pop up. They last for a couple of years and then they vanish. And this was one such case because I remember that event. There was this prominent sponsor, a businessman who organized the event, but as soon as he lost interest and sort of vanished from the scene, that was it. So it was kaput. But at any rate, we're here to look at the games that my wife played last week, and I'm going to set the scene for you. So, as I mentioned already, the winner of this event will automatically qualify for the Women's Continental Chess Championship, and it's a winner-take-all effectively. Now, we're going to pick it up in round number 7. At this point, my wife was on 4.5 points out of 6. She was 1 point behind the leader, Zoe Tang, also representing the United States of America, who had 5.5 points. So, first game, this is round number 7 of the event. My wife is playing with the black piece against Daisy Corey Tello. Now, probably a lot of you people who are watching this channel are unfamiliar with the Corey brother and sister pair. Daisy Corey is a sister of Jorge Corey, who reached about 2,600, maybe a little bit above that. Daisy herself was rated in the mid 2,400s, and in fact, I played her all the way back in the FIDE World Cup in 2014 in Norway. So she's a player who has been very strong. Her rating has gone down a bit in the last decade or so, but still someone to be feared. So with my wife 1 point out of first place heading into the 7th round game, at this point, when I was helping my wife prepare for the event, I was not telling her anything about thinking about first place. It's simply try to play good games, try to have a good result, and go from there. All right, so round number 7, the game starts with knight f3. My wife plays d5. We get g3, and now we have this move b6. Now, I've realized I've referred to my wife every single time versus calling her by her name, which of course is Atusa Percassion. She does have a YouTube channel for anybody who is wondering. It is WGMHitusa, so do make sure to check that out. So we got this position, knight f3, d5, g3, b6. Now, again, keeping with the theme of how you try to prepare for games, I don't want to give away too much perhaps, but this is a system that my wife also played quite recently in the United States Chess Championship, where she played in St. Louis. She actually had this position, I believe, against Anna Zatonsky as well as Jennifer Yu in that tournament. So it's a good thing with the Continental being so close to the US Championship, because a lot of the ideas that Atusa was playing in the US Championship, she's now able to use in this event as well. So we get b6, bishop g2. Bishop b7. Also worth pointing out that I played the system against Gregorio Parin in a Title Tuesday not so long ago either. So we get castles e6. Now we have the move c4, and here we get pawn takes pawn and queen to a4. Now knight d7, knight d7, and knight to e5 is played here. At this point, it's a pretty dry position. One of the arguments behind playing b6 right away in this opening setup is that normally when white goes g3 and bishop g2 to go for the Catalans, if you can oppose this bishop right away on this long diagonal, you mute the bluntness of the bishop. So we get queen a4, knight d7, knight e5. We get takes. Now we have to move knight to f6. We get takes, and now we get queen c4. Now this position is already completely fine for black here, because without the bishops on the board, white doesn't really have any way to create major threats. And like in a lot of Catalans, normally black is going to look to play c5 here. And if black can get the structure with a7, b6, c5, and in specific with no threats on this diagonal, black is always okay. So we get c5. The game continues with knight c3. We get bishop e7, a4, and now we get to move castles. Here Daisy plays a5, and now we get to move rook b8. Now at this point, it's already a little bit better for black, primarily because white has this issue of this dark square bishop, which is very, very passive here. If white tries to go b3, black can always play something like knight d5 followed by bishop f6. If we get takes, you're going to see a pawn structure very similar to the game, which is just better for black as well. So here we get this move a5, and the idea is that white wants to try and open up the a file for the rook. Now again, if we look at this position and white goes d3, you'll notice that even if you put the rooks on d1 and c1, just to illustrate this, let's just say you get some position like this, just to set it up, something like this, you'll still notice that the rooks are on closed files. Black's rook on c8 is perfectly placed. If you ever go d4, I guess it's white's or it's black's move, so let's just play a random move here. If white ever goes d4, you can take the pawn, and now you attack the knight and the queen. So white can't really play d4. b4 would be the same story. Takes, bishop guards the pawn, and now there's pressure on the c file as well. So if you get the situation, the rooks on d1 are fine, but black's rooks are much better placed, also because down the road, with white not being able to play b4 d4, you could even go check, king moves, and rook to d4, queen b3, rook b4, and now the rooks are super active here. So back to the game. After castles, we get a5. Corey's trying to use the rook on the open a file, so we get to move rook b8. Now this is where Daisy makes a shocking blunder, after which frankly she is close to lost. It's hard to understand why, and you're gonna be like, well, queen b5, what's the big deal? Now this move is a huge mistake, after which white is really struggling, and the reason is that once you play this move, you're no longer going to be able to open up this a file for the rook, and you're going to see exactly why in a second. Now what Daisy should have played is she should have traded the pawns and played queen b5 here, and now after queen b7 and king g1, black is still arguably a little bit better after rook to a8, but after takes d3 followed by the development of the bishop on the dark squares, black has a small positional advantage, but it's nothing special, and I do think the game is very likely to end in a draw. But we get the move queen b5. Now this is also going to highlight why chess is such a brutal game, because you play a move like this, just a little bit of a slip. I understand why Daisy played this. She figured, well, why do I want to release attention and trade right away? I want to keep the idea of a6 or ab6 alive, and it should be completely reasonable. However, after we get queen b7 check, now we get the move f3, and here we have the very strong move a6 being played. Now this move is incredibly strong because white cannot take this pawn. Daisy probably thought she could play queen takes pawn. Easy, right? Takes. We're in some kind of end game. White's completely fine here. You have bishop e3, weak pawns on c5, weak pawn on a6, no issues at all. But after we get this position with a6 being played, if you play queen takes b6, now black can just move the queen to c8, ignoring the queen trade, and after queen to a7 here, only move to save the queen. Now black goes knight d7, and already out of nowhere, the queen is getting trapped here. Probably the best move is knight to a4, but after rook to a8, you'll notice the knight covers a square. This queen is simply trapped on the a7 square here. So it's a disaster. Out of nowhere, the queen is getting trapped. Now, of course, white could play knight b6 here, but after takes, black is an extra knight, and black should go on to win. So at this point, Daisy has to play the move queen b3, and now we get the move b5, and suddenly white is in all kinds of trouble. You have a long-term weakness on a5 that can be targeted. Black can push c4 or b4, and it's already very difficult to defend. So now we get the move d3, and now Atusa plays the move rook fd8. We get bishop g5. I am going to apologize in advance for the people who are watching this video and they hear me like toggling between saying my wife or Atusa. I am sorry about that, but it's all a little bit awkward. So we get bishop g5. Now we have knight d5 being played. We get knight takes knight, and here we have the move pawn takes knight being played. Now this is an excellent move here by Atusa to take the knight with the pawn here, because what's happening here is that we're reaching a specific pawn structure. Now probably the most important thing, once you're past the beginner stage where it's all pure tactics and you're trying to play at an intermediate level, let's just say around 1600 over the board, which is probably 1900 2000 online, very high, I know, is pawn structures are very important to understand. Now this pawn structure we have here can occur out of many different openings. Usually the pawn would be on f2 versus f3, but this is a structure that can come out of Sicilian Dragon. It can come out of the English. It can come out of there's some other opening I'm forgetting right off, out of a plethora of the other Sicilians as well, but I'll just show you exactly what I mean by that. So I'm going to go back to the start of the game, and I'm going to set up a different opening here. Now one of the specific lines that can occur is you can get something like an accelerated drag. Now mind you, the English is a variation of a reverse Sicilian, so it's all kind of the same, but you got some position like, let's just say bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, castles, bishop e2, and at some point this isn't exactly how it goes, but let's say you get takes, bishop here, you get f3, bishop c6, knight d5, takes, and here white takes with the e pawn. Now it's a little bit different, obviously the pawns on the queen side are back, but the fundamental thing you'll notice about this position here is that you reach a structure where you have the pawns on c4 and d5, and black has these pawns on f7, d6, and e7 here, and there's a lot of pressure towards the pawn on e7. Now obviously this version is better than we're going to see in the game that Atusa has, but nonetheless you'll notice the similarities. Now this is also why I strongly recommend that people play a lot of games online. You pick one or two systems, because the more you see these patterns, like where the pawns are, subconsciously it's going to help your brain wire it so you start recognizing the similarities in various positions, even if the pieces might be on different squares altogether. So back to the game here, we get this position after pawn takes pawn, we get to move bishop f4, rook c8, and now we have to move rook a c1. Now rook a c1 is a move designed to try and prevent the effectiveness of this pawn push, but also just keeping an eye on the pawn on c5 as well. So now we get the move d4, and you will notice we have reached this exact pawn structure. The pawn is on f3 versus f2, which is a slight difference, but still you have e2 and d3 versus c5 and d4. Now this is already very, very bad for white for two simple reasons. First one is this pawn can be targeted very easily just to set it up. If we get this position, the pawn is very weak on e2 here, and even if white tries to play e3 at some point, now after takes in a position like this and rook d5 followed by rook d8, black is doing very, very well because the pawn on d3 is weak. So it's pretty much a situation of pick your poison here for white. You either have to play e4 and take the weak d3 pawn, or you have to try and defend the weak e2 pawn. Either way, it is very unpleasant. So now we get the move rook c2. Here we have the move rook c6, rook c1, and now we get rook e6, a very nice rook lift, bringing the rook over to target the pawn on e6. Here we get h4, and now we get rook e8, setting up the attack on the pawn on e2. We have king f2 played, and now we get the move h6, and here we have this move h5 being played. Now h6 is a multi-purpose move. It creates the lift for the king on h7, but you also have the idea to play g5 and kick the bishop away from f4. Now at this point, white is already very close to loss no matter what you do, but h5 is a logical way to stop g5, because if you go g5, there's en passant, and now black is actually not doing so great. But after h5, we get to move bishop g5, an excellent move by Atusa here, getting ready to line up the legendary triple stack, attack this pawn on e2 and win the game. And at this point, white can already resign. So we get takes, now we get g4, and here we have this move c4 being played. This is a great move. Queen to e7 works. Queen c7 is also good as well, by the way, to try and infiltrate and sneak in with the queen. Queen b8, same thing, but c4 is probably the most straightforward and to the point move here as you put pressure on the queen on b3. So here we got the move queen to a3. If white were to play rook takes pawn, hoping for pawn takes rook and queen takes queen, that will not happen, because here you take the juicer, and after king to g3, there's a beautiful Botez gambit. You sack the queen with queen takes pawn, and after takes rook e3, it is simply checkmate. King has no squares available. And if you go king g1 after queen takes f3, it's simply going to be checkmate on g2 on the next turn. If white were to play pawn takes pawn, now there's rook to e3 attacking the queen, and after queen b4 and d3, now black is crashing through. Once again, this pawn on f3 is super weak, e2 is also weak, and at this point white's position is collapsing. So we get queen to a3. Now we have the move rook to e3, following through with the plan of trying to play against these three pawns here and finish the game in style. We get to move rook to d1, and now Atusa plays queen b8, and here Daisy Coritello resigns the game due to the threats of queen to h2 and rook takes e2. This is just a very, very clean game, I would say, for my wife. She wins this game in very, very precise fashion. Very important, by the way, because one thing that I have stressed a lot is that when you play for themes, and I've said this to my wife on many occasions, but I would say even for players who are trying to improve, when you play for themes versus when you play for the themes, you try to follow a straightforward plan, it tends to work out a lot better than doing heavy calculations for the most part. And this is just a fantastic win. I will say that this game was one of the best games I've seen my wife play in the last couple of years, and it's made me really optimistic about her chances to win the tournament. All right, so she wins in round number 7. So now we're going to move to round number 8. At this point, she is on 5.5 points out of 6. She is 1 point behind the leader, Zoe Tang, a 16-year-old from America, very, very talented and promising, talented and promising junior who's on the rise right now. She did not qualify for the U.S. Women's Championship. I'm not sure if her rating had a gap right during the qualification period or what, but she is somebody who will be one of the players to look out for in the next year's 2025 US Women's Championship. At any rate, rated 2306, the leader in this tournament at this point, 1 point ahead of my wife. Now, my wife is on 5.5 points out of, or is on 4.5 points, or is on 5.5 points out of 7. Zoe's on 6.5 points out of 7. At this point, this is basically a must-win game for Atusa here. She has to win this game. Now, before the game, I did give her some advice. One of the things is the games were being broadcast, so I did take a look at what her opponents were playing. I gave her some general advice, and this is one of the cases where I saw that Zoe was playing the Sicilian every game. So we get e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and we have the move bishop b5. Now, one thing that was interesting is I was looking at Zoe's repertoire, and one of the things that I thought was interesting about it is that when she played with black, she played either d6 or knight c6. Now, when she played d6, every single time she played this, she would go into the classical Sicilian / rouser, bringing out the 2 knights and the pawn. But when she'd play knight c6, d4, takes, every single game of hers would feature e5 going into the Sveshnikov versus playing the classical Sicilian. So when you see such a rigid approach, you see specific systems all the time, it helps a lot in terms of trying to figure out where you want to try to look for a weakness. So my wife plays the move bishop to b5 instead here, because now you don't want to go into heavy theory. Also, I might point out this was the second game of the day. A lot of these tournaments that are being played have 2 rounds a day versus a classical 1 round a day, like in professional chess, or in the top professional tournaments, I should say. So we get bishop b5. Now we have the move e6, we get castles, and we have the move knight e7. Here, rook e1 is played, and now we get the first surprise of the game with this move b6. Earlier in the event, I had seen that Zoe played this move knight to d4, but in this game, she goes knight g7. Now, I told my wife to play rook e1, and the reason is, again, you want to play for themes and straightforward ideas. And in this position, white's idea is very simple. If black plays, let's just say d6, you want to go c3, let's say a6, bishop a4, b5, bishop c2, and you want to play for this move d4, building the classic big white center. Very simple plan. It also means that you minimize the amount of time you have to use in the opening phase of the game. My wife is someone who struggles a lot with her time usage. She gets into time pressure in many games. So what you want to do is you want to play for straightforward and simple plans versus something where you spend a lot of time in the opening calculating. So we get rook e1, b6, and now we have the move c3. Now, it's worth pointing out this move is not perhaps considered to be the best move in the position, but it has been played by none other than our customary shout out to the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen. So if Magnus has played b6, well, why not play it? So we get c3. Logical move, try to build a big white center. We get a6, and now we have the move bishop a1, bishop to f1, I should say. Now, Atusa could have played bishop a4. I think she was probably worried about c4 here, because now if you go d4, there's n peasant with pawn takes pawn, and the game goes on. White is not worse or anything, but it kind of avoids the idea that you want to go for with the big white center. So we get bishop f1. d5 is played, and now e5 occurs, and here we get the move d4. Now, at this point, I was not super happy seeing this position in the game, but I did have some hope still, because even though Atusa is unable to build a big white center with d4, after d3, bishop b7, and c4, we now end up in something that is very akin to a King's Indian attack. Now, normally, the King's Indian attack will occur after something like this, just to set it up. You get something like this, for example. Let's just say b6, g3, bishop b7, bishop g2, knight g7, and castles. And this occurs out of the French. Again, keep in mind, at the lower levels, this really is symbolic about why you want to try to play a lot of systems when you're growing up, as opposed to just playing one system. Because if you play the French, even casually, let's just say you play some online blitz games which don't matter and you test it out, it can help down the road. So even though you'll look at the evaluation bar and you'll think that here black is better, the great thing about this position is that Atusa's opponent Zoe Tang has never played the French defense in her life, so we've transposed into a French pawn structure here similar to the King's Indian attack, and I actually thought that Atusa's plans here are much easier. So you get knight g6. Now here, what should have been played was this move h6 here, and now if you play a move like h4 to try and stop g5, after queen c7, queen e2, and g5 anyway, sacking a pawn, let's say you take knight g6, black is actually much better here due to the potential open h file. You can castle the queen, a lot of threats looming towards this white king on g1. But again, if you've never played the French defense and you don't understand this pawn structure or the concept of sacrificing the pawn, you probably won't play this. Sure enough, we get knight g6, we get g3, queen c7, queen e2, guarding the pawn. Now we get bishop e7, and here we have bishop g2, and now we get to move castles. Now this, of course, is a mistake here. It's already, frankly, a little bit hard to play for black, because once you put the knight on g6 here, you can't ever play h6 or g5, and the pawn on e5 is permanently protected by the knight, the queen, and the rook. Now, why did Zoe put the knight on g6? She put the knight on g6, in my opinion, I could be wrong, because she thought she's developing. You want to castle the king, develop the knight. And also, in a lot of lines within this Ross Limo Sicilian, there are many lines where, for example, say white were to play d4, you take, and the natural developing move is to go knight g6. So in my opinion, the reason she played this is because she thought, well, very natural developing move. You play it in other systems, you want to castle the king, it just feels right. But because the pawn structure is different and it resembles the French more than a Sicilian now, this is just a huge mistake. So we get castles. Now we have h4 being played. Idea to start pushing the h-pawn like alpha 0, and here we get the move h5. Now it's already a very hard position for black to play. If you try to go f6 after takes bishop g5, the rook and the pawn are very loose. Black is in all kinds of trouble, and when you play h5 to stop the pawn push, it's creating a long-term weakness. Now you could move the rook, but after h5, h6 anyway, let's say g6 and bishop to f4, let's just say rook d8, knight d2 followed by knight e4. There are all kinds of weaknesses on the dark squares around the king, and this is a dream King's Indian attack. So we get h5. Now we have knight bd2, rook e8, and here we get the move knight f1. Now, even though Atusa does not play the King's Indian attack with the white pieces, I think she probably had looked at some classic games from the famous first American world champion Bobby Fischer, who actually loved playing the King's Indian attack. So even if she didn't know the exact themes or the ideas, she still probably remembered that you can bring the knight to the king side here, like Robert James Fischer. So we get rook c8, knight h2, and now we get bishop a8, and here Atusa plays the move bishop g5. Another great move here. You're hoping to trade the b's, attack the pawn on h5, and just win the game. We get bishop f8, and now we have the move g4. Now, what you guys are going to notice is you'll see the eval bar just loses its mind. It just says black is better here. Now, the important thing, again, is about simplicity in chess. Now, speaking about another world champion, one of the players who really loved to play simple chess was Jose Raul Capablanca. His games looked like masterpieces. It just felt like really smooth positional play. And, of course, in the modern day chess, when you look with the computer programs, you'll see that there are many positions where people blunder, including the challenger for the world championship and the current world champion, Gukesh and Ding Liren, or former challenger, I guess is what Ding would be at this point. But you'll see there are a lot of blunders that can happen. But remember, when you look with the computer, you start to lose your objectivity as a human. And when I was watching this game live, I was basically screaming at my computer screen, hoping to see the move g4, because I knew there was no shot that at this level, let alone at the top level, you would see the best line that the computer recommends would be played. So we get takes. Now white's very much on cruise control. You want to go h5, h6. Black has no pawn break, and it's looking very bad. So we get bishop e7. Here Atusa plays queen d2. Another move that I really like. h5 is fine, but after knight to f8 here, you could play queen d2 right away as well, but you also have to worry about something like takes, knight f4, so you want to be very careful. So we get queen d2. Now we get queen d8, and here Atusa plays h5. Now this is slightly imprecise order, of course, because she should have played h5 right away. If she'd done this, for example, let's say takes, queen d8. Here I think is there a knight f7, which might be good for white. Knight f7, h6, many different possibilities, but the game goes on. So we get this. We get knight to h4, and now Atusa takes correctly. We get takes, and we have the move queen f4. Again, very, very solid moves. These might not be the perfect, precise moves, according to the computer, but very straightforward plans. You bring the queen here, you want to play h6. If black plays, let's say knight a7, you trade the knight for the bishop, and it's spaghetti-o time. You have knight f6 check, creating the fossil. You check the king, attack the queen, you win the queen, and you win the game. And maybe you even get a classic lolly checkmate on g7 as well. So we get the move f5. Atusa takes the bishop, black takes. If you were to take the knight, there's knight f6 again. So we get takes, knight b4, and here Atusa plays h6. Now we get queen d7, trying to stop the checkmate. Atusa trades the bishops, and now we get the move rook e4. Now this move is another excellent move here because you bring the rook to e4. You want to rotate over to g4, lift the rook. You also dodge any knight c2 tricks, and at this point, due to the king on g8, which is super weak here, very little protection around the king, black's position is crumbling. So we get king h8. Atusa plays king h2 here, intending to go rook g1. We get takes, queen h5, rook g8, and now we have the move queen takes pawn. We get queen h7, queen f6, rook g7. If you were to go queen g7, there would now be knight g6 check due to the pin. King h7, check, block, check, and after takes, and rook h8, it's simply a checkmate. So Here we get the move rook g7. I don't know why I'm getting some error there. We get this move rook g7, and now Atusa plays the move rook g1. Here we get rook to g8, guarding the rook on g7, and now we have the move rook g6 being played. Now at this point, all roads lead to Rome. Even rook g4 is strong, but rook g6 is a really nice effective move here because you simply want to go rook to h6, winning the queen on h7. We get knight takes d3, and now we have rook h6, and here Atusa's opponent Zoe Tang resigns in the game. It's kind of a little bit of a shame that she didn't get to play the checkmate on the board with something like knight takes f2 and knight g6. This would be absolutely beautiful. Black is double pinned. You can't take with the queen because the rook takes the king. You can't take with the rook because the queen takes the king as well. So it would have been really nice to get this double pin on the board. She isn't able to get it, but nonetheless she gets a very critical win here. And with this meant that going to the final round number 9, Zoe Tang was on 6.5 points, Atusa on 6.5 points. And we're in a situation where it's very tricky. Now, the reason it's very tricky going to the last round is that, first of all, Atusa has the black pieces in her game and Zoe Tang has the white pieces. So basically, if Zoe Tang wins, Atusa has to win. Now, to make matters even more complicated, on board number 2, there was a player who was a half point behind Atusa and Zoe Tang, a player by the name of Thalia Cervantes, who, if she won her game, she would have a better tiebreak than either Atusa or Zoe if they were unable to win. So as such, I told Atusa going to this game, try to play your game, just try to relax, enjoy it, just stay focused. Now, one of the things I think Atusa had in her mind was basically focus on her game, try to do well, but she definitely felt that she had the sense that she had to win the game. So we get e4 here. Now, this final round, she has a black piece against a 2174 women's international master, I believe from Venezuela, if I'm not mistaken. And now we get e4, e5. Now, before the game, I spoke with Atusa a lot. I was telling her I had some various thoughts: play e5, play Sicilian, play something else. One of the things that I thought she might want to consider was a Najdorf. I actually ended up telling her not to play the Najdorf for one simple reason. Her opponent, Javier Belén Gómez Barrera, had 3 games in the Najdorf in this tournament already. Every single game that she had featured the system. I believe it was with bishop e3 and h3. Now, this system is not like very special for white or anything, but it's very important to note that when you play your opponent, you don't want them to feel comfortable. And when someone has played the system so many times, even if you come in with great prep, they're going to be feeling very confident, having seen the position so many times. They're going to be very familiar. You don't want to do that. So Atusa plays e5. We get the move knight to f3. Now we have knight c6, and here we get the move knight c3. Now this is a terrible situation to be in if you're Atusa, because knight c3 is not what her opponent had played. When I looked at the games, I'd seen some Italians, I'd seen some Spanish, I'd seen some Scotch, but not the dreaded 4 knights. So we get knight c3, knight f6, and now luckily we get the move bishop b5. I've said on many occasions that this 4 knights with d4 takes is one of the most solid openings in chess. It's almost impossible to win this from the black side if your opponent is very solid with white. So this is not what you want to see. At least we get to see bishop b5, so there's a little bit of life in the position. And now Atusa plays the move d6. Now, this is a decision that Atusa makes because I think she was already in this all-in mode, gotta win at all costs. It's not a very good move objectively, but it keeps the game going and also keeps all of the pieces on the board, which sort of echoes some of the sentiments I made about the World Championship, where when you keep all the pieces on the board, you maneuver around, there are many more chances for blunders and or a decisive result. So we get d4, takes, bishop d7, we get castles, and now we have the move bishop e7. Now, since I'm doing this recap a week and a half after the tournament's ended, you guys aren't going to see the timestamps of the moves, but it's worth pointing out that Atusa was playing very fast in this opening, and her opponent was using time. So we get bishop f4. Atusa castles, we get rook e1, and now we have bishop g4, queen d2, and we get the move knight e5. Now, you're obviously looking at the eval bar thinking, what is this nonsense? The thing is, when you're in a must-win situation, I mentioned this in relation to game number 12 of the World Championship, in a must-win situation, all of like the general thoughts about playing correct chess, not blundering, just playing the best moves, those go out the window because you're in a situation where a loss is effectively the same as a draw. So you're very free to take many more liberties. And this is also why I think in chess, when you play freer versus being worried about your rating and everything else, you tend to play better. So we get h3, bishop c8, a4, c6, bishop f1, a5 played here, and now we get the move rook d1. Atusa plays queen c7, and here we get bishop e3, rook to e8. And again, even though white is much better and has more space, all of Atusa's moves have been pretty straightforward here. c6, logical move, because if white doesn't go a4 just to set up a point, you might want to play b5 followed by b4, trying to attack the knight on c3 and the pawn on e4. Okay, so white goes a4, c6, logical, a5, logical to stop white from pushing the pawn, maybe down the road, put something on a dark square like b4. These moves are moves you can play pretty much instantly. Queen c7, of course, white is pressure on the d file, right? Logical. Rook e8, very logical. The idea is to go bishop f8 and then down the road something like knight d7 and maybe even knight c5. Put a lot of pressure on these pawns on e4 and a4, and you have the rook on the open e file. Very, very logical, as they like to say, the classic acronym, which is KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. So we got the move f4. Atusa plays knight g6 here. Knight d7 is not possible here because white is knight f5, attacking the bishop and the pawns at the same time. Get knight g6, now we have g3, and here Atusa plays the move d5. Now what's remarkable about this position here is that at this point in the game, Atusa had, I believe, 1 hour on the clock. The player started with an hour and a half plus 30-second increment for move 1. Her opponent here, I believe, was already down to 15 minutes at this point in the game. Now the reason for that is that Atusa's moves, even if she's worse, her moves have been pretty straightforward and simple. Her opponent is the one who has to prove the advantage. I'm sure her opponent knew she was better here. You have more central control, pawns on e4 and f4, rooks on d1 and e1. Black is a passive bishop, passive rook. All the trumps in the position, pun unintended, are in white's favor. So you know you're better, but the problem is when you know you're better but you don't have a clear plan, you spend a lot of time. So even though Atusa is much worse here, her opponent is way down on the clock. Now also I would point out at this point, Zoe Tang, the other player who's playing for first place, had already won her game. So for Atusa, she knew this was all in territory. So we get g3. And here Atusa plays d5, and this is one of the important things about psychology and time management is you guys probably have seen many of my recaps or even my live streams, and I will lose my mind when people mismanage their time. And the reason for that is when you mismanage your time, like Ding did in the World Championship, you're only potentially handicapping yourself, and it is also the only thing in the game of chess that you truly can control. Now, when I mean control, what I mean by that is that in chess, if your opponent plays great, they use their time, they find the best moves, there's nothing you can do about that. You can try to influence them psychologically or like sit over the board and, you know, hunch over with your arms crossed and everything, try to intimidate them. But if they play the best moves, unless you're Professor Xavier, you can't really do anything about that. There's just nothing you can do. But you can definitely control your time management, the amount of time you use on moves. And there are a lot of cases where players mismanage, they spend too much time on moves they shouldn't. In this game, I don't know the exact time usage of the moves, but for example, this move like a4 should have been played right away. G3 should have been played right away. A lot of these decisions, when you spend time, it can only hurt you and it can almost never help you unless you're going for a concrete plan, like a 6 or 7 move tactical sequence where you just win the game. In many of these cases, if you mismanage your time, you're only potentially harming yourself. So Atusa plays the move d5 here, and this is a very important moment because Atusa had an hour versus I think 15 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever it was, and she uses about 15 minutes before playing the move d5, and this move made me really happy. Again, you know, I think about chess as someone who plays a lot. I never think about what my fans are, you know, they're watching my games. I never think about how they're feeling or what's going on when they watch. But I will say, when I was watching this game, I started screaming at my screen once again. I literally was screaming. It's like I was like, play d5, play d5, play d5. In fact, I think when Atusa was thinking here for the 15 minutes or however long she used, I actually went and ran a lap, or I think I ran 2 laps. I ran like 2 laps just to try and get rid of the stress because I was really nervous. But she does play d5 here, which is the best move in the position from my standpoint, because now it creates a major imbalance. Now white could take this pawn on d5, but after bishop b4, let's say white were to take on c6, you get takes, bishop g2, and bishop d7. White is up a pawn here on the queen side with a 3v2, but with the pin on this diagonal to bishop on b4, the rook on the open lane, the other rook coming to the center. White is better, but black's moves are much easier. White has to find the plan, and with looming time pressure, it will be very hard to play. So we get e5. Now we have knight d7, and here we get the move e6. At this point, Atusa's opponent was down to about 5 minutes on the clock. Frankly, it's a very hard position to play for white for a couple of reasons. First of all, you don't see an obvious attacking plan. f5 hangs the pawn. You can go knight f5 here, but after bishop b4, black is simply going to quietly move the knight away, and now your knight will have to retreat. On top of that, here you have to start worrying about ideas like c5. Say black at c5 and d4. Suddenly black is doing very well. The knights, bishops, everything is getting active in a hurry, and black also has a big black center to boot. So all these things combined make it very hard to play, and as soon as I saw a d5 on the board, I'm gonna be honest, I knew, or I felt very strong that Atusa would win the game. So we get knight d7, e6, knight f6, takes. You might think, well, black's king is in the center, but due to the big black center and the classic connect 4 here, black is completely fine. We get bishop f2, bishop d7, bishop g2, and now Atusa finally achieves the dream by putting the bishop on b4 and pinning the knight on c3. We get queen d3, and now she plays king g8, just retreating the king out of the center. And here we get the move rook takes rook, and now we have knight f3. Now again, very hard to play in this position, and this is why I'm so critical of time usage in general, because you'll see what's happened here. Atusa's opponent has used a lot of time. She's gotten low, but she's also misplayed the position. When you spend all this time, if you aren't able to play the absolute best moves, you're putting yourself in a very bad situation. You're handicapping yourself. And at this point, with limited time on the clock, I knew Atusa would win the game because you have the big black center, you have the two Bs greatly placed here, you control the open file, and everything is falling apart for white. So we get knight f3. Atusa goes queen c8, pressuring the pawn on h3, and now we get the move knight g5. This is a blunder after which there's no return, but already here it's very hard to play. If you go king h2 trying to guard the pawn, there's bishop f5, queen d2, and now knight e4 here, queen, knight, everything is collapsing here. All kinds of forks from the knight on e4, and black is totally winning. So we get the move knight g5 instead. Queen f1 is the one way to try to keep the game going, but frankly, after h5, h4, and let's say bishop f5, this is just a beautiful position for black. So we get knight g5, bishop f5, queen d2, and now h6 attacking the knight, and here we get the move g4. Atusa takes knight, we get pawn takes pawn. If white were to take the bishop, which is the best move, after knight takes f4, now black is up a pawn on the king side. You've got a great bastion. The pawn on f5 is hanging. There are all kinds of threats on e2. White's king is super weak. All roads lead to Rome. So we get pawn takes pawn. This is a blunder which loses the game, but frankly, it's already over. We get knight to e4 here, and now we get knight takes knight. I believe Atusa's opponent played this move with like 1 second left on the clock. She was very, very low on time. White could play bishop takes knight, but after takes here, black has 3 pieces versus 2. Knight goes to e5 and f3. It is all over. So we get knight takes knight. Atusa takes the queen, we get knight d6, and now Atusa plays move queen e6. Here we get knight takes rook, and we get this move queen to e2, rook to f1, and now Atusa plays the move bishop e4. Many ways to win, but at this point, all you want to do is simplify, trade off a few pieces, and end the game immediately. So we get bishop e4, knight d6, takes, knight f4, and at this point, Atusa's opponent, Javier Belén Gómez Barrera, resigns the game. Atusa gets the win. With this victory, she wins the Continental Championship. She ties for first place with Zoe Tang with 7.5 points out of 9. But Atusa wins on the tiebreaker, which means that she will qualify for the Women's World Cup, which will be taking place in, I believe, Tbilisi, Georgia, in July of 2025. Now, on top of that, for Atusa, she actually has won the Continental Championship before when she represented Iran in the past. She won the Asian Continental Championship, I believe, in 2010. So she has now won both in Asia and also America. She's won on 2 different continents, which is, of course, quite remarkable and amazing. At any rate, this was a very nerve-wracking tournament. I'm going to say I was following this event quite closely. Obviously, it got near the finish line even more so, but I felt like doing something a little bit different, doing a recap. I mean, you know, one thing that I would say for me is that obviously I love playing chess. I like doing well, but honestly, when I see people around me do better, that actually at this point in my career has much more of an impact than my own individual results. When I was younger, I would have said that, you know, I cared so much about my own, but you know, especially as I get older, it's really nice to see people around me have a great result. You know, if my brother were to play somewhere and do well, or my stepfather were to play and they have some great result, I would obviously do a video on that. But you know, I just felt like doing something different. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of my wife's games, Miss Atusa Porkashian, playing in the American Continental Championship for women in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. I would also say, of course, make sure to check out her YouTube channel once again. That her channel is WGMHitusa. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with recaps and everything else, all kinds of content in the very near future. But I hope you guys enjoy it. Sorry if the video is a little bit long, but that's what it is. So I'll see you guys soon. Have a good one. See you. Bye.